First mistake that I did here was not really knowing anything about... Okay guys, now that the boat's all foamed up,
mod, and it was just keg it. Swing the hatches.
full.
Definitely a one-man machine though.
To run the rod holders. Since people leave them in their pools year-round, all the other mods that are going to come along, 3 compartments and 2 small storage compartments, and I frame 4 compressors. So just inserts down here, front lights here, and I've modded it to my specs. That's all my bait, which is
I was gonna do anything to fix this jalopy of a boat. In terms of fishing ability, this was the best bass boat platform. It is no longer Jon Boat to bass boat or Jon Boat mods.
It has come down to this. Everything we've ever tried, tested, failed, and learned. After almost a decade of knowledge and skills gained, I will put everything to the test. Every movement needs a final form, a testimony of the journey. To be able to put out a boat, unlike anything I have ever done before along this entire time. Quiet desperation ends when your talents and passion combined, but those 2 elements will forever be tested, because momentum must always be earned. Testing from life is inevitable. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Hey quick, there are some major players that helped us out. Flashlights, again with extraordinary quality LEDs, the best on the market with almost no questions asked warranty. They've got lights for everything, and I fish in the night mostly, so their product was a huge part of my strategy. They even have this light bar that has just a direct beam that sees almost a mile out, and it's so precise it will not beam off the top of your bow or your console. And the power supply doing all this came directly from Epic batteries. It gave me probably the most high quality, robust batteries I've ever seen. They're virtually waterproof, heating cell technology to resist freezing. They're Bluetooth, but they also have Vitron capability, so you can see a direct monitor of your battery level performance. They also hooked me up with some high quality chargers, but because I'm charging more than one 12-volt battery in this boat, I got an RS4 charger from Real Pro. This is the best economy charger on the market, because unlike all others, it just automatically detects what type battery you have it connected to, so it doesn't matter, lithium, AGM, lead acid, it'll just know what to do. And it's also very light, virtually waterproof. All this stuff is awesome. There'll be links in the description and comments for all these products. Thank you very much. So 2 Jon Boats that I have. The first one was a very simple, non-complicated, budget-friendly, but very nice restoration of an old 1648 aluminum bass boat. But for every budget build, I want to also make an equivalent one that is maxed out. So let's go ahead and get this out of the way. This is the boat. Those are the capacities. It's a Lowe 16 Pro Angler, and the year is unknown. How I got it kind of vexed me, but it is the best hull for a Jon Boat that I've ever seen, and possibly the perfect platform to make my ideal version of what an ultimate tiny boat rig for me would be. I've never been able to actually do this during the entire span of my time here, but my time is running out to do this. It's now or never. All of us know it. Ryan is the first to step up and finish his rig. It came out exceptional. A perfect tiny boat for him. An awesome looking build quality, but also a list of accessories that are suited specifically for his style and his preference in fishing. And though Ryan was the first, he's not the only one. Nate has also stepped up to build his dream rig. After all this time grinding to build this company, we're all finally in a position where we can do this. Starting out, I'd already cleaned the hull and epoxy primered the inside, painted the outside, and did work to the transom. A while ago, somebody donated very kindly this piece of 1.5" Coosa board, which I thought would be the ultimate transom. It turned out that its strength per span without being glassed over is really bad. It's going to be inadequate to put in this boat, so we ripped it out. The synthetic board material is really nice in glassed boats, but it's almost got no place in aluminum boats, except for very specific instances. The best, strongest, and most long-lasting option is to put an aluminum transom in. We make them in cuttable planks like a piece of 2x12 wood, and this allows DIYers to go ahead and put their own transom in full aluminum without having to weld. Some things didn't go right during the install. Like, it sunk deeper than the stock transom did, so the stock lip didn't fit, and I had to do a bunch of rework. I had to get a piece of tubing and weld it. Then a bunch of grinding and rework to try and make it look like it was flush. And then there was a million holes. I have never found an old boat like this where there was not a million excessive holes in the back of the transom that made no sense. So I tried to put a bunch of low heat welds, just similar to soldering, to solidify those up and just make sure there's a little bit of penetration into the parent transom we just installed. I've done this on 2 other boats and it seems to work well. Just takes forever to grind off and finish correctly so it doesn't look absolutely terrible at the end. Unlike most Jon boats, this one actually came with removable end caps, and I was really tempted to use them, but after I welded a whole new transom and they didn't really fit well, so I took some angle and sheet metal and just fabricated my own. It was not my favorite thing to do, but we got through it, and then we reprimered it, and a lot of the old primer was epoxy primer, and it was still really good, so we just kind of sanded the oxidized layer off of it, and it's ready to get painted. I'm going to be using an Atlas microjacker, not because I'm a huge fan of it, but because it is small and compact, and I need that because I'm running it as a tiller boat. That means I need the tiller as long and in as much as possible, and any other bigger jack plate will offset it way too far back, and it'll just make it harder for me to drive. When you're sealing the transom, remember it's hollow. You need 3 5200, and you may have to reseal it a few times before you get a complete hold. If you're new to this channel and you're wondering how I even got to this point, it was by tinkering constantly and just learning, being self-taught. There were a few other places out there to kind of maybe talk about things like this, but nobody was doing anything like this. I was throwing off-the-wall concepts, crazy ideas, putting together things that either drove people insane with anger or things that people thought were pretty genius for the skill. The part where I really excelled, I think, was my first aluminum frame. It was heavy and ridiculous and all riveted, and there was some brazing, but the system I was able to put in forth after learning that took me a long way very quickly. You might be approached by people who tell you, don't go into the trades, it's hard life, go to college so your life will be easier. Yeah, if you're not meant to be an office jockey, it doesn't matter what level of prestige that you achieve in that profession, you as a man will be miserable. The rig that I have in my head that we're trying to put into fruition here would cost somebody buying this third party an obscene amount of money. I don't have an obscene amount of money. I do all right for myself, but I'm not so independently wealthy I can just go buy a boat like this. What I have to leverage in spite of funds is my skill and a lot of hoarding. I did get some good donations from our sponsors and also from the Midwest and the Southeast shop together, but I've also been saving and hoarding leftover parts in aluminum scraps, hardware, anything. I even got trolley motors and grafts saved up. We're talking years of stuff. You combine all that with a bunch of experience gained from a multitude of projects where I've seen what works and what fails. I now have planned out what an ultimate rig for me would be, one that is truly bulletproof and unstoppable. I've noticed in the vast majority of people who are trying to build boats like these, most of them are overly obsessed with how the boat looks versus how it performs, and I am the absolute opposite. This boat can look like dog crap, but if it performs the way I think it will, then it will beat everything out there. To lay waste to a few malinformed rumors spread by some trolls in this community, we're going to frame this back out of 1/16 and the front out of 1/8 inch angle in tubing to show you with facts that they're wrong versus using rhetoric and conjecture, which is what they've been using. And also in this boat, we will be introducing a concept I've been wanting to do forever, and I'm finally able to do it in my own primary rig, which is an unsinkable floating core with a hollow void between the outer hull and the inside. In all the boats that I've gutted that were Jon boats, the majority of the damage to the hull, aside from the transom, was from foam sheets, whether it was marine foam board or styrofoam that was just saturated in water. But it wasn't the foam's fault, it was the fault of the builder or the manufacturer that put that layout in there to begin with. What should happen here is there should be no foam on the hull. The way the Jon boat is, water's just going to naturally stack up and sit in there. There's not good drainage, even with integrated spines. But that does not mean that foam is not going to go in here. In fact, an obscene amount of it is going to go in. Enough foam to offset the entire weight of the boat itself. But in order to do that, there has to be sections above the hull with a void in between the entire core, which is why we're going through all the effort to sheet metal and frame these things. The ribs are going to be what separates the core from the hull. After the transom, the Livewell should be the first thing that is framed in, because a lot of what happens during the flow and the connections to it dictate the rest of how your layout needs to be. We had an additional 12 by 30 hatch in the front, and that is either going to be for batteries or for your miscellaneous accessories like life jackets, emergency gear, boating essentials, etc. If you buy a framing kit from us, you have the option to get the sheet metal pack as well, and that's what these are. They're 4 foot long by 16 inches wide, and the way we're making the boats, they fit exactly the way they need to, not only for the sidewalls, but for the main decking. Primary design for the frame is complete. It's slotted, so there's flex between the rails at all points. They will need to be tied in deeper, but we're gonna do that a little bit later once the entire frame is done. We're reusing the stock subfloor that came with the boat. No need to change it, and I need all the aluminum that I can get at this point. Aside from making accommodations to the floating core, the back is actually very simple. It's not terribly complex, aside from maybe the Livewell plumbing that's coming later. But the front is gonna be its own unique animal. This deck will hold a lot of secrets, unseeable to the human eye. The only way that you'll ever know how it's built is if you watch it now. The front is being completed with a bunch of leftover aluminum square tubing of different sizes. It's all an 1/8 inch thick, but yeah, you see those gaps and stuff. That's just how it had to be. That's not going to really matter once it's all put together, as you'll see. I ended up having to use any sort of tubing that I had in the leftover reserve because it's the only way that you can effectively frame in boxes like that and still drop our hatches into those liners or into a Livewell or into this giant hatch. And underneath all those liners and bins, there's going to have to be a floating subfloor to complete the process for the floating core. And we're just using the old deck that came on the boat to begin with. We're using as much of the stock build as we possibly can. One part of the build that seems simple but actually is very easy to screw up are the sidewalls, and you just need to measure 3 times before you cut. I also strongly recommend a pair of 14 gauge electric metal shears like these, and a pair of hand snippers like these Craftsman we're using to cut out the edges. Both of those are a lot safer and cleaner to use than a circular saw or a grinder, and they're also very cheap to get. The front deck will be done in sections, and this wall will be separating the first section from the next. Then we're going to go ahead and attach a piece to finish the lip so we can connect the remaining piece of the subfloor to help complete the floating core. This will be non-load bearing, as the giant aluminum hatch liner that I have for that middle compartment floats even above the subfloor. Without that design feature, I would have to make a much more robust joining piece to pull the subfloor together for a load-bearing face. And the rivets are not as strong as weld, enough of them spaced close enough together are extremely hard to move, and were the best way to actually make this subfloor work. Otherwise, you'd have to cut into a bunch of individual pieces and weld them directly to the ribs. All these hatches in this boat are not there just to be there. It's not like the boat with the most hatches wins. It's how they're put in, where they're accessible, because the right boat turns minutes into seconds. You have seconds literally when you fish. You fish for hours, and then in split-second windows they come. And if you don't have a layout that allows you to access the precise amount of gear as quickly as possible, you will miss those windows and always be behind. We've gotten the front part far enough to move on, but there's still so much work and strategy and design that will allow us to pull all that off. I really don't even want to think about it because it's going to be a lot. I'll likely procrastinate until I have nothing else left to do but that. One major compartment for the batteries after I finish this rod locker framing will go right here, and that will complete mostly my layout. Being able to weld has helped me circumvent a whole lot of problems that would have caused me a lot of rework and work around. A lot of these strategies, you have to be able to think 20 steps ahead, and when you can only think 12, you miss things, and being able to get around that has been instrumental. In fact, there's just a multitude of things that I could have never got accomplished without welding. For the longest time, I just used creative ways on how to use rivets so I could just get around learning how to weld, partially because most of my audience is likely like me and doesn't really have the time to learn how to weld, but I've really shifted my stance on that just because of how useful it is. I didn't think it would be this useful, but I'll tell you what. Hey guys, if you watched this video to this point, it means there had to been something good enough for you to stay this far. Please leave a like button and comment if you can, and do that for any other creator on YouTube that you value because it helps them trend. So this was one of my first successful Livewells. It might be the actual first. I was super proud of this thing. 1 million pumps, overflow fittings. I tried to make a drain port out of a kayak deal that was a really thin plastic tote, framed 2 of them in the back of this boat. And long story short, it worked, but it pales in comparison to what we're about to do to this boat. Back into it, we need to do parts of the Livewell. Can't do all of it. A lot of this build is just going to be done in spots. We're using the Flow-Rite version 3 Livewell Ultimate kit. It's the kit that is installed in all major bass boats and OEM. It's engineered with great precision. It's truly a remarkable system. We're installing the system inside our factory Livewells. Our Livewells are 18 gallons and they come stamped down the crease in the middle with an indent to hold that through hole fitting. Now there are already stock ports back there for the original Livewell, I begrudgingly am going to use them. I thought about just welding new pieces of aluminum over those holes and then making new ones, but then I chickened out and just went through with it anyways. This is a larger 1 1/8 inch overflow fitting. So the overflow fitting is, I always try to put it to the right. And on the left, I like to put the aerator fitting, which is only 3/4 inch. And if you bought one of our live wells and you have one of our lids to go in there, go ahead and pop that lid in there and trace that line. That way you don't make the through hole fitting too high to where the lid like mashes with it, and then you'll have to make another hole. It'll just be horrible if you did that. And I just take the nuts, place them underneath that line, make the hole, trace it, and then go ahead and just drill them out with this type of bitting. I actually don't even know what this bit is called. A step down bit, step up bit, I don't know. But that thing. And one of the coolest things the Flow-Rite has ever done was make a dual valve that is both an aerator and a pump out nozzle. It can do both. It comes apart in several pieces. Just use both of these nut flanges, leave a little bit of an overhang, but only after sealing it from the inside. Sealing it from the outside really doesn't matter. It's the inside where the water is. Then, with that little bit of overhang for the threads, go ahead and screw that last little part on there for the nozzle. A 1 1/8 inch through hole fitting is required on the other side, or anywhere you can put in the live well, but it serves as an overflow, and it just bleeds out directly to the bottom of the transom where we had that other fitting. So here is the aerator pump out nozzle, the overflow fitting, and the adjacent fittings where the water comes in and goes out. The bracket right there, the bracket right here, all the hoses, the aerator pump out nozzle, valve, remote line, through a conduit, and all the hoses run right here. I really have them all curved over, but I had enough elbow fittings, and since we're using the premium kit, we had quick lock systems, and so I had a few left over, and that looks just way cleaner than how I usually run it. Got the subfloor in for the gas tank. I made it come up. The gas tank will just fit right in here. I had to re-bracket this, cut that actually. I had to cut the transom support and then re-weld this back onto it to give it a nice bracket. These are the fittings. That's the through hole fitting. We got to pop the screen in there. See, after we've heat set those hoses, they stay that way. You'll need to do very, very, very slight reflex once you go to put them all back on here. If you're a Facebooker, come and check out our homepage and our group. We have one of the largest groups on Facebook to ever exist for stuff like this. So come along and join our community. So now we're on to wire rigging, which is going to be complicated because foam is going to be so saturated in this boat that we have to make conduits and passages for it to run through the foam and into the compartments, into the liners. And that is actually what makes this complicated. If we weren't going to do any advanced wiring or lighting, and we just needed a basic boat that could operate well during the day, then this whole thing could be much simpler. But simple is simply not what we do here. These day boxes up here in front have 4 bleed-off ports, the biggest in the industry, but those bleed-offs have to run through the bottom of the liners and into that subfloor so it can drain out to the actual bottom of the hull. That entire void, along with all of these voids, will be completely filled with foam, but not before we run 1,000,000 conduits through the entire thing. We've already started with this nylon tubing. I think it's PEX. I don't know exactly what it's called, but it's for water. If you run it through the standard plastic stuff, it just binds, but that nylon is extremely slick, and you can run the wire all the way through the back, like 20, 30 feet long loops, and it'll never bind inside the tube. 1,000,000 things also need to be done to the front. New ports need to be made for all the mass amounts of fish finder wiring coming through it. I always like to use a rod locker grommet for all that wiring. It seems to work the best. We have to make a bunch of ports and holes because copious amounts of conduits of all types are going to be how we pull this whole thing off. Otherwise, it can't be done. And even I knew it had to be done, but I didn't have enough foresight to know the sheer amount of just how many conduits actually needed to make it in the boat. So many. One for this, one for that, one for this wire, one for those wires, one for the trolling motors, some for the fish finders, one for the live scope, another for the LEDs, another for the basic wiring, for all the electronics, for all the accessories, and then a bunch of additional drains that I added to each hatch just because I wanted it that way. And that's where a lot of that PEX line running directly into the subfloor is doing. All the crevices and voids between the subfloor and the main walls have either been sealed off with duct tape or gap filler like this. And this is just the one side. It started getting cramped pretty quickly. You maybe wonder how sticking all those tubes down the other side of the rod locker. Because all this conduit can get very heavy very quickly, we are using this black conduit. That black conduit is extremely light. Loads lighter than any other pipe, and that doesn't matter because there's so many going in here. And you also notice throughout this that a lot of tubing is either taped or bound with baling wire against something else that is harder or more rigid, and that's because the foam, once you start to pour it in there, if the pour foam starts to expand too rapidly beyond my control and it starts to shift all this conduit, it can definitely remove it from its ports and then pour into the subfloor, ruin my entire design. So it is extremely crucial that I go over this 3, 4, 5, 10 times, however many times. Before we can move on to the advanced rigging, we have one last thing to do, the rod locker. You're going to require at least 2 major walls to pass conduit through in order to pull this off. If you're not going to be foaming the section where the rods are going through, then you're going to need to secure the tubes somehow. Most people can secure them with pie clamps at the very end of the second wall. Try to trace your templates out between the both walls as evenly as possible, even though both walls may not be the same size due to the boat tapering toward the front. However straight you get your holes determines how flush your rod locker ends will fit once you flare them out. Deburr any rough edges, which are common after use of a hole saw. We are putting EVA foam lining in all major compartments, including this one. At this point, we only need to do the face. The rest can wait. Now we need to flare the ends of the tubes. I do this by using a heat gun and a very wide wine bottle. When the end of the tube reaches a certain temperature, it becomes malleable. Do not press down too hard on it or you'll crinkle the end of the tube. Whatever PVC you choose is your choice, but I prefer this black PVC. I don't know exactly what it is, but it is loads lighter than all the other brands. It is also more temperamental when you're trying to flare out the ends, but it's well worth the weight savings, given our margin for error. When you start to put tubes into a taper where the wall starts to bend, it's necessary to heat up the entire tube. You may need to use a hammer to tap them in. I would use a soft mallet, not that big giant Thor hammer, but that's all I had. Once that section is done, you're free to fabricate the rest of the rod locker. The back ends just have giant open slots that are rimmed with door edge guard. This design replaces traditional rod grommets because you can slide rods in and out in a much tighter space. We're using cam lever latches. You measure 2.75 inches away from the edge and you use a 2.5 inch hole saw. Adjust the depth of the cam to the desired height. When you put door edge guard, it gives you a little bit of a cushion so you can kind of have a compression fit on it. That is the kind of fit you want. That way you have less vibration through the hatches under motoring. The entire rod locker process will not be complete until we pour foam around the tubes and solidify them in place. But for now, we can test fit. As you see, all 5 to 6 rods fit in there quite tightly, but because of those back channels being long, you can slide the rod butts in and out to get them at will. Hey guys, this end reveal video for this boat is far from what is actually going to come from it. An entire masterclass series coming specifically for patrons and channel members is going to be exclusive to you, coming shortly. Stay tuned. Now that we know that we've got every available conduit ready for each specific wire, plus some extras, we can now start to truly go into rigging this thing. I can't get too much farther in the front without installing at least some of the turf. So we're going to go ahead and just install this cut groove. It's just a fancy little trick that if you're trying to bend it to fit a certain curve in your boat, you could just cut down the cut groove and then piece it together like this. We're only going to be turfing the bow though, and just the very front of it, because as we build this boat from back to front, the rigging is going to happen from front to back. When you're going to try and learn a new skill, you're probably going to suck at it. But it is that initial sucking that helps you fail your way to success later. And the more skills you have, the better off you are in life. A jack of all trades and a master of none is still a lot better than a master of one. That's how the actual saying goes. Our graph mounts are quite popular, and for good reason. They take care of everything. There is an accessory that handles all problems. You need a drink caddy, you need a tool holder, you need a puck holder for your GPS, for your smart trolling motor, it's all there. You can even modify it to stack 3 9-inch graphs all in line, and that will help tremendously with my final design. We're almost ready to wire, but there's a few things we need to do. We need to finish all the conduits in the back, and then once we're done with that, we actually need to paint it. Quick reminder, all components used to build this boat can be found right here. We got most of it directly on our website, tvnation.net. Thanks for checking it out. As I said before earlier in framing that we would end up tying these side rails to the hull strategically, which worked, but when we did it, we ended up melting the paint. So now we have to do a recoat. And also the gunnels are graded and the turf is not going to stick well to them. So I used an orbital sander to sand down the grading as much as I could to prep it for painting, and it'll eventually be a good surface for the turf. So this boat has been pretty well cured for about 3 days now. We let that primer cure. Definitely a 48-day cure or better is what's needed for this primer. If you put it on, it dries immediately, but it's pretty fragile in its first 24 hours. Then really after 2 days, it's pretty strong and solidifying. So how we're gonna break this up, but it seals once it cures. So you gotta break it up. We recommend a red Scotch-Brite pad. Possibly the gray one is about the roughest you wanna go, but you really wanna go light because this one is a little bit more abrasive. You're really just trying to break the surface. It'll turn kind of pasty, powdery white. And the bigger thing is you can go on this fairly decent without having to worry about whether or not you're going to go through the primer. So you go through the primer, it defeats the whole purpose of the primer. We're going to be doing it on the paint too. Have these new sections where we welded, which melted the paint, so we had to hit these spots. And then we're just going to overall be kind of rescuffing this paint and just giving it a new layer of paint. If you're wondering how well a Rattle-Can paint job holds up, this one has been sitting in my backyard for a very long time painted, and it was pretty good. But even if I didn't burn through the paint during welding, it's been a few years, and a fresh recoat really wouldn't be a bad idea. A lot of people wonder how to do it. All you gotta do is just scuff up the paints and then clean it. And again, I really like the two-part process where I use water and vinegar mix to get off most of the real grime, and then I use alcohol to get off all the micro-contaminants left after you get most of the hard grime off. If you want to tell how the hull is completely clean, go over it with one rag until it's dirty on all sides, then keep going it until you get a fairly clean rag every time you wipe. Then you're ready for paint. The key to spray painting is never let one section that you paint dry. Once you start, you cannot stop. I don't care what finger you use, your pinky, your index, your thumb. You got to move through all 5 fingers just to get that spray nozzle down. Once one finger gets tired, do what you have to do. Switch hands even. But do not stop. You have to go up and down evenly, and the paint has to overlap as it's wet. If it's too hot outside, it'll dry, or if you're too slow to paint it or you take breaks, it'll dry. It can dry once you've done painted and overlapped it as you're moving one way, but you cannot stop. That's how you get a clean mirror finish with no flat spots. Let it cure for at least 48 hours before taking it out in the water. This is my first wiring job. I was extremely proud of it, and it took me forever. Almost as long as it's going to take me to wire this boat. The difference between then and now is not intellect, it is simply experience and momentum. And going through a bunch of mistakes, getting yelled at by a bunch of marine electricians on what and what not to do, listening to their advice, and then implementing it into my own designs to finally get a final form of what it needs to be. There it goes. It is now time to wire this boat. Nothing else can be done until it's finished. And we have a very tall line of electronics. The most that I've ever had to connect, honestly, will run through this boat. And that's saying something, because we've really done some things. Wiring can be extremely expensive and really tough to sort out everything you need. A lot of your local places will not carry marine grade hardware, and a lot of the places that do are generally sold out or it's extremely expensive. But after doing several boats apiece, my crew and I pretty much have this down to muscle memory, and we know more or less the exact amount that you're probably going to need. And in doing so, we're able to make these kits with not only all the components that you'll need, but the right amount, so that you're not overspending and getting a bunch of bulk items you won't use after you're done wiring. We're going to have about 4 times the wiring that an average tiny boat would have inside it. For Pete's sake, the wiring on the trolling motor has completely covered the cable sleeve. You can't even see it. It actually took forever to do all that. Heaven forbid I have to unrig that and do something else. Half of those go to the fish finder, half of them go to the power bank, but all of them go through that grommet. And in order to channel all those wires down through the grommet into the conduits, we are using fish tape. You can get a pretty cheap one from Harbor Freight or get this Milwaukee one, which has a nylon cord that doesn't bind or have memory. It's the best one I've ever used. Now, once I've channeled all wires into this middle section, I still have to figure out where I'm going to put everything. The best design that I have that was my favorite was in this boat, where I actually had all the wiring into one compartment you could access directly from the top, with the panel coming out of the side. And that's what I want to do again. But before I can run any of the wires anywhere, I have to make this panel. And FYI, this panel design can be easily done with wood. In fact, I did the initial one out of 2x2s and I think just a piece of plywood. And this is more or less leftover 1.5" tubing and sheet metal on the back, riveted right into the bottom. I'll need one major switch cluster. I'll need 2 cutoff switches, one for all the fish finders and one for the house power to the boat. I think I used a 2-inch hole saw to get those to mount flush to the front while being mounted in the back. We have over 20 items that need wiring, but less than 10 that actually need switches. In fact, most of the items already have their own switches or don't require a switch at all. We also left room on the panel to install the jack plate switch, which is later. Right now, we're going to go ahead and pre-rig the Flow-Rite Livewell timer. They come with very detailed instructions and already pre-wired harnesses that you can just plug in, and we'll show you here a little bit later on how to tie those leads directly into a fuse block. The timer dial gets placed with a very small set screw, so hopefully you have a little micro tool for that. We'll also be adding a dual USB port. We'll actually be putting 4 to 5 of these in the entire boat, because a lot of what this boat is going to be rigged for is directly for camera filming and social media. A lot of the components that you get may already come with wiring harnesses that are marine grade with tin copper wiring. Be sure to check before you discard. All the pins on each of the switches and on this Flow-Rite switchboard all require spade connectors, and they will require their own set of wire leads running to and from major sections. In fact, a lot of preliminary wiring is going to be done in this panel way before we ever drop it into the boat. In order to pull this off, you're going to have to make your own harnesses, which is essentially nothing more than cutting sections of the duplex wire that comes in your kit. And for the nylite switches in specific, which is what we use in all of our switch panels and clusters, you're going to have to daisy chain wires together in series in order to make them work. These are all 5-pin, and 2 of those pins are automatically taken by the ground wire. So we're going to go ahead and daisy chain an entire harness to cover all the ground leads for each switch. You may also not want to do this and wire each switch individually, and you can do that. You'll just have to run 6 individual ground wires as well as power leads, and it eats up your wire very quickly, and it also just makes things much more complicated and hard to run all the wire through from one section to the other. So for that reason, we just daisy chain the ground. We're using 14 gauge marine grade wire to do this, and when you double it up in the daisy chain, you're going to need the yellow spade connectors because those are meant for thicker wire. So essentially 2 14 gauge wires equal a 12 to 10 gauge wire overall thickness. So the only time you'll be able to use a blue 14 gauge spade connector is at the very end. All the ground leads are pretty easy to memorize because they all go at the very top. They loop in one after the other. If you're having trouble securing the spade connector to one of the pins, gently grab it with some needle nose and wiggle it snug. Do not be over aggressive with this process or you can potentially break the pin and you'll need a new switch. You should have a total of 12 connections, with the initial connection being really long, like what you see on the right, because that one is actually going to run back to the bus bar. If you're trying to wire the Flow-Rite switch, that middle pin on the switch itself is the power pin. That powers the entire board. So whether you have the switch up or down, in constant on or in timer, both modes feed from this power pin, and then you see the other 2 adjacent wires are just different sections that one feeds the constant on and one feeds the timer. And then you just have to worry about the ground. And there is a ground pin on that board, I just haven't connected it yet. As you are sizing all your wires and leads, think of a favorable distance between your switches and the fuse block bus bar combos, as that is where we will be linking most all of this to. Too much lead and you just have an excess plethora of wire that may be difficult to deal with or kind of stow out of the way while you're rigging everything else. Too little and the wire will end up binding in the event that you need to troubleshoot or move things around. We are now ready to make the power leads for the switches, which will require some daisy chaining, but not in the same way that you did it for the ground. The ground is a complete daisy chain that powers the all ground, but for this section, you will need 6 individual power leads to go directly into each switch. The reason there is 2 grounds and 2 power leads on each switch is because one powers the actual accessory tied to the switch, and the other one just powers the LEDs inside. So you have a 2-for-1 special in each switch. Now, if you wanted to, you could do all the ground leads the same way we are doing the power leads right now. And you would have a ground lead that goes to the bus bar and the power lead that goes to the fuse block. Both would be double piggyback, so they could power the LED and the power accessory to the switch. And then you would have the last pin on the very bottom to power the actual accessory. That's where the power goes out to the accessory. The reason that we piggyback all the grounds together is because, for one, we can get away with it, and two, it just saves tremendously on wire and is way less of a headache. You could theoretically also piggyback all the powers to the switch just like you did to the ground. In fact, if you get a switch panel from Amazon, it is exactly powered like that, with only one pin on the very bottom to power all the leads. The reason we recommend against that is because those switches end up failing. Because you can make 6 individual ground leads, but they'll all connect to the same bus bar, so there's almost no point. The same is not the case with the power leads, where they go to each individual fuse well. So the power coming out of each fuse well is different, and one switch may try to starve and overpower all the others, depending on the amount of current drawn. But when you're done sizing all of them, they should all be relatively equal size. Remember, relative to where you're going to place a fuse block versus the switches, if you're going to put the fuse block to the left, then the right side of the switch power leads need to be slightly longer to compensate for the amount of distance away. When you're done with the switch panel, it should look like this: clean in the front, party in the back. That last male spay connector running to the power of the Flow-Rite timer is specifically for the aerator pump's power line. It ties directly into that one, and when the time comes, we'll tie it right in there. We also have full-on custom panels like this one that look really good inside consoles or center consoles, or just in a wall even if you want. It just was too tight to stick in here, so we didn't. Alright, so back to the actual spot where we're going to tie in all the wiring. Go ahead and place your panel in the desired place of choice. For me, it's going to be closest to where I'm going to be sitting at the tiller. That way I can kind of reach down with one hand. Now it's time for us to connect all those individual power leads to each individual fuse section, and then obviously the ground lead to the bus bar. You cannot have a ground lead going to a different bus bar just because you run out of room. Even if they're going to the same battery, you will have backfeed issues. So again, whether it's from an entire switch panel or from each individual switch, make sure the power and ground leads are going to the same fuse block. You may have to run multiple fuse blocks that are not completely full, and that's fine. That is the way it has to be. Now all that work we put in earlier with the label maker to make sure these wires are labeled correctly is really going to start paying off. Now you can start using the 14 gauge spade and ring connectors. The ring connectors are going to be put to the 1 ground and the 6 power leads. Those 6 power leads need to go to each individual fuse well. For organization reasons, try keeping all the power leads going to your switches on one side, and the other side can be used to lead power to items and accessories that already have their own personal switch. Also, if you have certain components in your boat that require specific types of power and you don't want them intermixing, then I specifically would have a fuse block bus bar combo only for the fish finders and graphs and associated electronics, one for the house battery, and if you're having any major amp draw, such as a speaker amp or amps for LEDs, any sort of high power items, I would power those directly to the battery with an inline fuse, or if I didn't have that option, because everything's so tight like it is here, I would get my own separate fuse block and just give it to them. Right now I'm trying to organize and separate which wires are going to fish finders and which wires are going to external accessories with their own switch. Now when I'm doing this, I don't want to cut away all of that duplex sleeve. I only want to cut away just enough so that it reaches the fuse block and bus bar correctly. Remember, because these have their own switch, that they're just going to go right directly to the fuse block and bus bar, and there's no individual power leads coming out to switches like we have here on the left side. Here we have a brief example before we stick it into hyper mode. Notice how we now have 2 fuse blocks, and we have them strategically placed because we think that's going to be the best layout for everything we have to tie into them, that it will bind the least and be the cleanest once we secure everything. Having your wire secured cleanly is extremely important, and you might have to redo your whole cluster. Again, you might put it on one way, and then after you've attached a bunch of stuff, you might have to unattach it. My biggest time consumer in here is going through, unattaching, reattaching, unattaching, reattaching, because one wire was binding or underneath another wire or wasn't flowing correctly, and the flow of wires that is clean dramatically cuts down the spaghetti effect. Like, there's a lot of things going in here. There's probably going to be 3, possibly 4 fuse blocks, plus that RGB controller, plus other things, and If you don't have it clean here, I don't know what you're going to do. Later on, if you have to troubleshoot it for any reason, any sort of lack of cleanliness or lack of labeling and lack of direction will lead to major troubleshooting, maintenance, and diagnostic nightmares down the line. And trust me, you will eventually have to go in here. You cannot escape it. I've now added a 6-gang fuse block bus bar combo there to the left, and that is specifically for all the fish finders. Now, all these USD fish finders, a lot of fishermen like to have a direct inline fuse going right to the battery so that nothing happens inside the fuse block bus bar. There's a lot of controversy on whether or not it starves power and distorts readings, and I don't really know or care because there is no way I can run that many fish finders through the conduits I have and it be a good thing to try and stack those all on one individual battery lead or a series of batteries. The fuse block bus bar combos put in here strategically are the only way I'm going to be able to get that done. Once all your wiring is attached to the correct fuse blocky bus bar, notice how we have no power leads going to the fuse block or ground ends going to the bus bar. But that's where we have all those elbow fittings from conduits going directly into the battery compartment. We'll be feeding 6-gauge wire, both power and ground, first to the cutoff switches, and then from the cutoff switches to the fuse blocks. The ground ends just go directly to the bus bars. One cutoff switch will control 2 of the major fuse blocks. So those 2 12-gang fuse blocks are going to be controlled off one cutoff switch, and the bottom cutoff switch is going to control specifically the fish finders. You want them separated. Each cutoff switch has its own designated battery for this reason. The yellow battery is the main power battery for the boat. That is a 100 amp hour lithium. A smaller 12 volt lithium powering all the fish finders. You could go up to 16 volt and higher, but for charging reasons, because we have that RS4 Real Pro charger that was charging a bunch of 12 volt banks, we are using as many 12 volt batteries as we can. Unless you want to only use your rig on farm ponds and very small lakes or extremely shallow rivers, you're going to have to prep your boat for rough conditions, and the only real way to do that, especially in a tiny boat, is with pour foam. It'll allow you to plow through waves like a much bigger boat, and with enough of it, you can make it virtually impervious to sinking. Without it, your boat is just a really good-looking floating death trap. And a lot of independent builders out there gut the foam completely out of boats, and they will not tell you, so you need to make sure.
Alright, it's all done. It's about as done as it's gonna get. We're finally at a point where we tied everything up, got everything secure, and we have a strategy to kind of pour this, and there's just nothing else left but for us to do it. I don't know if it's terribly smart to use the boat as a table, but we're going to. I have this piece of styrofoam that I will likely never use for anything else, and it can just act as a good bench table. I got crap everywhere, I got foam packets everywhere, wiring kits, tools, trash, more wiring. This stuff is US Composites 2-part marine. This is Total Boat. This channel grew up using this stuff. This stuff is still really good. It just, once it mixes, it activates extremely fast. With this stuff, it activates much slower, so you have more time to pour and more time to feed into it. This is the minute you get this stuff to a golden consistency, you immediately have to pour it or it starts foaming out of the fill bucket, and it's just not good. For that reason, get this. And there was a huge time where if you got this on Amazon, a lot of it was bad kits. Ever since you started getting the new stuff which comes in a plastic bottle like this, it's always been good stuff. I have not had any problems with it, but for a while Amazon had a hugely bad run to where if you didn't get it from Total Boat directly, you probably got bad stuff. So if you're gonna get Total Boat, don't get it from Amazon, get it directly from Total Boat direct, or you can get this stuff US Composites from our site tvnation.net. Normally we would get the biggest bucket we can. Like, that is a very big bucket, a 10 quart. I don't even know how many gallons that is. 5 quart, so this is a little bit over a gallon. 28 fluid ounces. Liters. We're not going to be using this one, or even this one. We'll be using these at the best, because we kind of do want, at least for the first pour, the foam to solidify and hold to it, hold on the piping, pour it on the piping, make sure it bonds to the piping in the tubing to the floor, that it doesn't expand too hard and push all my drain tubing out of the floor. That would just be horrible. Like, I wouldn't even know what to do if that happened. So I got an extra bunch of small ones and a few large ones once we get going. But we're really going to just be pouring small ones ever so casually. And then once we get a good buildup and we know that stuff's going to pretty much stay where it is, then maybe we can pour a little bit more inside this, like, chasm here. And then around the tubes, we'll pour there. And then this void, once it's poured here, that's like the last big thing before we can actually put the deck on.
Alright, if this is you, don't do this anymore. Stop it. It's not good. We've all done this, including me. I'm telling you not to do it. I've already done it for you, and I know it fails. Also, the styrofoam and the pink foam board, it's fine as long as gas never touches it, but if you're running gas outboard, it's highly likely that somewhere down the line it'll get into your boat and parts of your walls or floors will implode. So for that reason, you should just chuck it. In fact, anything that's not marine foam board or pour foam, get rid of it. Be an adult. This is what you want in your boat. Solid, 2-pound density, low water absorption, resilient to all chemicals including gas. Before you start to pour foam, just tape off all the crucial spots. When that foam gets on things, it's not good. Go ahead and just turn it upside down to get it a good mix since it's been sitting there for a while. Don't shake it though. That doesn't help anything. It needs to be an exact 50-50 mix. Any variant from that will skew the expansion. It needs to be stirred to a golden brown and then it's ready to pour. This is cut down a lot because the video is already so long, but we have a full masterclass on this pour foam expansion in depth. Why I did everything the way I did, but essentially it's small pours first, getting a nice even layer on the bottom, securing all those lines, and then when we pour a lot in where there's a lot of major intensity expanding, all the regular foam that's already solidified in the bottom, it's not only going to carry heat to expand the energy of the new foam you're pouring in, but it will hold everything in place, and there's less of a chance of it breaking or pulling apart upon an initial pour versus just pouring a bunch of it in at once.
And even after each pour is fully expanded, there's still a lot of heat and energy, and you want to immediately pour right on top of that to keep that same heat and energy, because it's heat and energy that allows you to get a max expansion. Otherwise you don't get a 2-pound density out of it. You end up using more foam and it'll be less buoyant, so always go for max expansion. But there are instances where you can pour max amounts, 90 to 128 ounces of fluid. This one, I'm thinking of putting 96 ounces directly in there, the whole thing. And in theory, it'll create enough energy and heat by itself to expand into a perfect mushroom. I could have measured about 80 ounces and got a perfect inside pour, but I like the overflow because now you got max expansion all the way to the very top. And that's the max level of foam that you can get in that void. Take a little bit of time to clean up, but that's what we put all that tape there for. And we use a short sawzall with a bent blade to get in that angle and cut it all flush. I also used a random machete I found in my garage, and an orbital sander did a really good job in polishing and smoothing out everything. There are 4 kits of foam total. That is over 1,200 pounds of reserve buoyancy put into this boat. And all of this could not have been completed without all the important work we did prior to all.
Hey, if you're surfing on Amazon, we actually have a web store there, and if you type our name in, stuff will come up. Check it out. It just depends on your skill level and your budget, but wood frames and decks, they do work. They'll get you through it. They might not last forever, or even a year, depending on how you do it, but the right setup, even a wood aluminum hybrid deck system like this that's resin coated and sealed, will actually last a very long time. And it's very strong per span. You can actually turf this once the wood is cured and sealed with either resin or some high quality epoxy paint. I would say this process actually takes forever and is not very effective if you're trying to flip and sell boats, but if you're going to try and do one for your own that's high quality while still on a budget, it's a good way to do it. But if you're just dead solid on an all aluminum deck, which is, to be honest, what a lot of the country's climate requires for a long lasting rig, well then there's a few ways to do it. If you got our aluminum hatches, then go ahead and mount them directly into the frame and then template around them. You can use construction paper, cardboard. In this case, we're using Graphics Duralar, which is a clear, non-crinkling plastic film, which is awesome for templates. You can draw right on top of whatever you're trying to get around, so it's an exact measurement every time. If you can get a local metal shop that you can source 090 thick aluminum sheets from, that may be the best thing. Otherwise, we will sell a sheet metal pack to you consisting of 090 for the deck and then thinner sheets for the sidewalls and subfloor. After you've cut your template out, just go ahead and trace it right directly onto the aluminum sheets. There should be enough cross beams and sections in the framing so where you can overlap the sheets. I know it's not the entire span of the full deck, but the lids take up so much of the deck that you're only paneling small sections at a time. So those little sheet packs, they actually work really good. We're securing it down with countersink rivets. If we were to try and weld it after all of this is done, then we would light a lot of things on fire and possibly ruin the foam and the boat. If you keep the rivets 2 to 3 inches away from each other along all the cross beams, it's extremely hard to move that and it'll be a very long lasting outcome. After you secure the paneling, there's a chance there may be gaps. You can fill those gaps in with silicone or some sort of 2-part thickened epoxy that comes out of a tube. They make marine applications for it, but the silicone is going to do just as good a job. All it's doing is just filling a void to make the entire deck flat. So when you turf over it, later on with stepping on it in use, you might start seeing little ravines or indents right between the sections of the hatches and the deck, and actually filling that in with silicone will stop all that. The tape is there to catch all the excess silicone once you've leveled it out with either a finger or a trowel, and then you want to pull that up immediately before the silicone starts to set, because once it sets, it'll start to pull everything up. Between a concoction of rivets and welding with a Frankenstein frame and even this nifty little grab bar, we're finally ready to finish the final steps and clean the deck off with one final cleanse before we go to put turf on the entire thing and finish it. Then the final rigging will begin and we'll be on the water. Hey everyone, just to let you know, we have been on YouTube for a long time and have a pretty serious pile of content. Individual videos, full playlist, a bunch of new shorts that give away a lot before we even get to release a big final video like this, and also lots of community posts to interact with you guys. Sometimes we run polls to get feedback from what you guys would like to see next. A lot of good stuff in here, and of course we also have our masterclass line for channel member exclusives only. Check those out if you want even more content. This is how we used to get it done. Just get the cheap bunk carpet from Lowe's, some outdoor glue, and slap it on that wood. And it looks pretty clean. Then we even tried up to 16 and 20 ounce. We thought carpet was unstoppable, that it was the best thing out there. But a handful of my affiliates were messing with EVA foam, using it entirely for decking in the inners, all of it. They said it was the best stuff ever. I didn't really believe them until I got a hold of some myself. Now, I'd always really liked those custom turf jobs on those super expensive high-end boats, of which there's no way I could even afford it, but again, leveraging something, whether it's money, skill, talent, a combination of all, I was able to achieve an end product that was not only similar in quality, but very fun to do and just an awesome skill to self-teach and figure out. It's something that nobody else was doing, and I was able to leave my unique stamp on watercraft that I was trying to customize. Like this little 10-foot palm prowler. To get a turf job custom like this would have cost me thousands, but I got it done for literally a few $100 worth of turf and some router bits. And I was able to become the artist for this. It was my design, my everything. But it wasn't until actually using it on the water that you really see the true benefit. Truth is, it could look like that, or like this, or anyway. EVA foam is mildew and mold resistant, it resists saturating with water, dries out immediately, it's very cool to the touch on your feet, even in the hot summer sun. There's almost no non-benefit to getting it. And the camo hydroturf is the most durable stuff for decking that I have ever actually used, even better than carpet. So naturally, all of us have all but completely stopped using carpet for these reasons and have just went exclusively with EVA foam. But the quality of EVA foam does matter. The stuff on Amazon is not like this stuff, and you will see a difference. This is just going to be a quick overview of how I installed it onto the deck, but we do have a full tutorial in our new masterclass. But to everyone's credit, there is no real right or wrong way to install this, only better and worse ways. And a lot of those ways are really contingent on the person. One thing you really need to remember is to install this at a room temperature or cooler area and keep out of direct sunlight. And if you need to adjust it quickly. Do not let it sit there for a while and then try to adjust it an hour later. The longer it sits, the more it heats up, or the harder you press on it. That's what actually activates the adhesive. But up until that point, you can adjust it all over the place. All the cut grooves in the camo make it super easy to line up, and then cutting it out is a breeze. Railblazer also hooked me up with enough gear, honestly, to build like 3 boats. Which is awesome because they make stuff that fit any type and size of boat, and their stuff is honestly the best of the market in terms of little gadgets that make your fishing experience or boating experience simply better. I rigged it all throughout the site. I even bought custom T-tracks to mount on the gunnel just so I could use their products, and they have actually been very instrumental in not only the filming, but just the fishing and rigging and holding crucial items during any application that I need. I was even able to finally utilize that entire hollow gunnel to mount those micro anchor poles, and I made a few additional accessories that I thought would be perfect for the inner core, and I also had these vertical day boxes. I got as many of them as I could and mounted them everywhere. Inside the main tackle store, inside the rod locker, inside the cockpit. They're extremely instrumental in not only saving basic boats where you don't have a whole lot of room to modify or adjust anything, but you need extra tackle and extra solutions. And a while back, we started making vertical tackle mods that would mount directly to sidewalls, and those have been extremely successful. People are mounting these directly to the triple bench seats in their Jon Boat or their V-hull, slap some turf on the benches, pause to make a little short front deck, and you actually have a very nice functional utilitarian style boat. Like I said before, your window is inches and seconds, so if you have a boat that turns everything into minutes and miles, then you lose. These vertical boxes will make a bad boat good, a good boat great, and a great boat unstoppable, which is why I put them everywhere. And well, do it again. In some boats, they're your only hope. Some boats are crammed so tight with gear and just everything that you got no choice, like this one. Most of the final rigging has been completed, just a few double checks, and after I load my tackle and my gear in the boat, there's just some few mods to the trailer that I have to do, and then I also did make some custom mounts for micro anchors. I think I've been extremely hard on them this whole time. I'm going to try and give them their fair run. I'm even going to try and overcompensate by making their own custom mounts specifically for them, installing them on this boat. And with that, this is the last of the final rigging, and we're ready to put this thing on the water. Creating your boat from scratch is a fun process, but it's the only one of its kind, and you don't know how it'll perform until it's on the water. It's always kind of nerve-wracking. Everything we've done from the very beginning has led to this moment. I stuck all of it into this boat. Every last little bit of knowledge, ideas, strategy. I took every little problem and adversity and mishap. Every time I thought to myself, man, I wish there was something for that. Something just to make it a little bit faster, more streamlined, more precise. A boat so complete that if you have any problems on the water, it is solely your fault. A boat that will resist the elements despite its small size. This boat will hold you accountable. You either are who you say you are, or you're not. It actually has a surprisingly shallow draft, barely sinks with 3 people on it even. It rides through rough chop the best that I have ever felt on a Jon Boat. Even with a floating core having a hollow void between the hull, you still can't feel any vibration. With that full 1.5 inch void there, no damage can ever come to the hull again. The foam will never become saturated. Water can't stack up in there because it's not allowed to. Even though it's 16 foot, it feels like an 18-footer. It wasn't built just to outperform the competition, but to outlast it as well. We're gonna have to put that one on scale, dude. Look how big that mouth is. 5'7".
What's the record?
6'4". Sometimes you may not get where you want to go, but you end up where you need to be. See you on the next one.